On the next day, January 1st, 1809, as the bad weather continued, and the emperor moreover felt the need to concentrate his army, we halted at Astorga, where the troops gathered one after another. They found provisions in abundance, which they were able to use all the more freely, because there was not a single inhabitant left in the town. The emperor had been deeply affected on learning that 3 grenadiers of his guard had died unexpectedly. Thus, despite the rain and the mud, he visited, one after another, all the houses in which the soldiers had taken shelter. He spoke to them, lifted their spirits, and we expected to set out the next day in pursuit of the English, when Napoleon received, by an aide-de-camp from the Minister of War, letters that led him not to go farther in person. It was probably the announcement of the hostile movements Austria was already making to attack the French Empire, while Napoleon and part of the Grande Armée were deep in Spain. The emperor therefore resolved to return to France with his guard, in order to prepare for the new war with which the Austrians were threatening him, but not wishing, however, to lose the opportunity to punish the English. He had them pursued by the corps of Marshals Ney and Soult, who, on departing, filed past him. English troops are excellent, but as they recruit only by voluntary enlistment, which becomes very difficult in time of war, they are forced to admit married men who are allowed to be followed by their families. Thus the regiments trail behind them a considerable number of women and children. This is a serious drawback, which Great Britain has never been able to remedy. Now it happened that, at the moment when the emperor was reviewing the corps of Soult and Ney outside the walls of Astorga, cries were heard in a huge barn. It was opened. It contained 1,000 to 1,200 English women and children who, overwhelmed by the long marches of the preceding days, made under an icy rain in the midst of mud and overflowing torrents, had been unable to keep up with General Moore's army, and had taken refuge in this vast barn, where, for 48 hours, they had been living on raw barley. Almost all these women and children were handsome, despite the filthy rags that covered them. They soon surrounded the emperor, who, moved by their wretched condition, had them lodged in the town, where they received provisions, and Napoleon sent a parlementaire to inform the English general that, as soon as the weather allowed, the women and children of his soldiers would be returned to him. Marshal Soult caught up with the enemy army in the mountains of Leon, and defeated its rear guard at Villafranca, where we lost General Colbert and his aide-de-camp La Tour-Maubourg. The English army hurried in all haste to the port of Corunna, but a dreadful storm making embarkation very difficult, it was obliged to give battle to the troops of Marshal Soult, who were following very closely. The commander-in-chief, Sir John Moore, was killed, and his army only managed to reach its ships after immense losses. However, this event, which the French at first considered an advantage, became very fatal to them, for General Moore was replaced by Wellington, who did us so much harm thereafter. It was at Astorga that my brother, attached to the staff of Prince Berthier, having been tasked with carrying dispatches to Madrid, was captured by the guerrillas, of which I was only informed long afterward. I shall have occasion to return to this event. While Marshal Soult pursued the enemy in their retreat toward Corunna, the emperor, accompanied by Marshal Lannes, left Astorga with his guard to fall back on Valladolid in order to take there the road to France. Napoleon stayed 2 days in that city, where he ordered Marshal Lannes to go and take command of the 2 army corps besieging Zaragoza, and to come and rejoin him in Paris after taking that place. But before parting from us, the emperor, wishing to give Marshal Lannes' staff a token of satisfaction, invited him to submit the list of promotion recommendations he had to make for the officers. I was included for the rank of squadron leader, and I was preparing to receive it, all the more as I learned that the marshal, coming out of the emperor's cabinet, was asking to see me. But my hope was cruelly dashed. The marshal told me kindly that in requesting a rank for me, he had thought it right also to propose old Captain Dagoucin, his former friend, but that the emperor had asked him to choose between Dagoucin and me. "I have not yet been able to decide," said the marshal, "for the wound you received at Agreda and the conduct you displayed in that difficult circumstance put the right on your side. But Dagoucin is old and is making his last campaign. However, no consideration would lead me to commit an injustice. I leave it to you to indicate which of the two names I am to have written on the brevet the Emperor is about to sign. My position was very embarrassing. My heart was very heavy. Nevertheless, I replied that the name of Monsieur Dagoucin must be placed on the brevet. The Marshal, tears in his eyes, embraced me, promising that after the siege of Zaragoza, I would certainly be appointed squadron leader. That evening the Marshal gathered his officers to announce the promotions. Guéhenauque was confirmed in the rank of colonel. Saint-Mars was appointed lieutenant colonel. Dagoucin, chief of battalion. d'Albuquerque and Watteville, legionnaires. De Viry and La Bédoyère, captains. As for me, nothing. We left Valladolid the next day, making our way by short stages with our horses towards Zaragoza, where Marshal Lannes took command of all the troops conducting the siege, whose number rose to 30,000 men, namely, the 5th Corps of the Grande Armée, come from Germany under Marshal Mortier, and the former corps of Marshal Moncey, which Junot had just replaced. The latter troops were of recent formation, but as they no longer had long marches to make, and were moreover seasoned by their success at the Battle of Tudela, they fought with great courage. Before the great insurrection brought on by the captivity of Ferdinand VII, the city of Zaragoza was not fortified, but on learning of the events at Bayonne and the violence Napoleon intended to inflict on Spain to place his brother Joseph on the throne, Zaragoza gave the signal for resistance. Its large population rose as one man. Monks, women, and even children took up arms. Huge monasteries, with thick and solid walls, surrounded the city. They were fortified, and guns were placed there. All the houses were crenellated, the streets barricaded. Powder, shot, and bullets were manufactured, and very large food stores were assembled. All the inhabitants were mustered and took as their leader Count Palafox, one of the colonels of the bodyguards, and a devoted friend of Ferdinand VII, whom he had followed to Bayonne, from where he went to Aragon after the arrest of that king. It was during the summer of 1808 that the emperor learned of the revolt and the plans for defense at Zaragoza, and as he was still under the illusion born of Murat's dispatches, he regarded this uprising as a flash of straw that would go out at the approach of a few French regiments. Nevertheless, before employing the force of arms, he wished to try persuasion. He addressed himself to Prince Pignatelli, the greatest nobleman of Aragon, who was then in Paris, and urged him to use his influence over the Aragonese to calm their excitement. Prince Pignatelli accepted this peaceful mission and arrived at Zaragoza. The population rushed out to meet him, not doubting that, like Palafox, he was coming to fight the French. But, as soon as Pignatelli spoke of submission, he found himself assailed by the crowd, which would have hanged him if Palafox had not had him taken to a dungeon where he spent 8 to 9 months. Meanwhile, several French divisions, led by General Verdier, presented themselves in June 1808 before Zaragoza, whose fortifications were still very imperfect. We tried to force an attack, but scarcely had our columns entered the streets when a murderous fire, coming from the windows, the bell towers, the roofs, and the cellar vents, caused them such losses that they were forced to retreat. Our troops then invested the place and began the siege more methodically. It would probably have succeeded had King Joseph's retreat not compelled the French corps before Zaragoza also to withdraw, abandoning part of its artillery. Thus the first siege failed, but our troops having re-entered Aragon victorious, the Marshal came in 1809 to attack Zaragoza anew. The city was then in much better defensive condition, for its fortifications were finished, and the entire warlike population of Aragon had entered the place, whose garrison had been reinforced by a great part of the Spanish troops of Castaños's army, beaten by us at Tudela, so that the number of the defenders of Zaragoza rose to more than 80,000 men, while the Marshal had only 30,000 to conduct the siege. But we had excellent officers. Order and discipline reigned in our ranks, whereas inside the city, all was inexperience and confusion. The besieged agreed on only one point: to defend themselves to the death. The peasants were the most relentless. Having entered the city with their wives, their children, and even their herds, each group was assigned the quarter or the house it was to occupy, swearing to defend it. There, people lived huddled together, pell-mell with their livestock, and sunk in the most disgusting filth, for they threw no refuse outside. The entrails of animals rotted in the courtyards and rooms, and the besieged did not even take the trouble to remove the corpses of men who died as a result of the dreadful epidemic that such neglect soon engendered. Religious fanaticism and the sacred love of country exalting their courage, they abandoned themselves blindly to the will of God. The Spaniards have preserved much of the character of the Arabs and are fatalists. Thus they kept repeating, "Lo que ha de ser no puede faltar." What must be cannot fail. Consequently, they took no precautions. To attack such men by main force, in a city where every dwelling was a fortress, would have been to repeat the mistake made during the first siege, and to expose ourselves to great losses with no chance of success. Marshal Lannes and General Lacoste, chief engineer, therefore acted with prudent method, which, despite its slowness, was bound to bring about the surrender or the destruction of the city. We began, as is customary, by establishing trenches to reach the first houses. Once there, those houses were mined. They were blown up with their defenders. Then the next ones were mined, and so on. But these works were not without great danger for the French, for as soon as one of them appeared, he was a target for the musket shots fired by Spaniards hidden in the neighboring buildings. Thus perished General Lacoste at the moment when he placed himself before a dormer to examine the interior of the city. The Spaniards' fury was so great that while we were mining a house, and the dull sound of hammer blows warned them of the approach of death, not one left the dwelling he had sworn to defend. We heard them sing litanies. Then, as soon as the walls, flying into the air, fell back with a crash, crushing most of them, all those who escaped the disaster grouped themselves on the rubble and tried to defend it by entrenching themselves behind the slightest cover, from which they began firing again. But our soldiers, warned of the moment when the mine would be sprung, stood ready, and as soon as the explosion occurred, they dashed rapidly over the debris, killed everything they encountered, established themselves behind sections of wall, raised breastworks with furniture and beams, and cut, through the midst of this rubble, passages for the sappers who went to mine the neighboring house. A great third of the town having been destroyed in this way, the communications established in that heap of ruins formed an inextricable maze, where one could find one's way only with the help of markers placed by the engineer officers. Besides the mines, the French employed numerous artillery and hurled as many as 11,000 shells into the city. Despite all this, Zaragoza still held out. In vain did the Marshal, moved by pity for these heroic defenders, send a parlementaire to propose an honorable capitulation. It was not accepted. The siege continued. But if the mines succeeded in destroying the houses, it was not the same with the vast fortified convents, for that would have required large works. We confined ourselves to blowing up a section of their thick walls, and, as soon as a breach was made, a column was launched to the assault. The besieged rushed to the defense. It was terrible, and it was in this kind of attack that we lost the most men. The best fortified convents were those of the Inquisition and of Santa Engracia. Our sappers, having reached the latter, had mined one of the walls, when the Marshal, sending for me in the middle of the night, told me that in order to secure my rapid promotion to squadron leader, he had reserved for me one of the most important missions. At daybreak, the fuse will be lit, for the mine intended to bring down the wall of Santa Engracia. 8 companies of grenadiers are ready for the assault. I have ordered that all the captains be chosen from among those less senior than you. I give you command of this column. Go and carry the convent, and I am certain that one of the first couriers from Paris will bring me your brevet as squadron leader. I accepted with gratitude, although at the moment I was suffering greatly from my old wound. as the flesh had formed, in healing, a ridge that would have prevented me from wearing a military headdress. Dr. Assalani, chief surgeon of the chasseurs of the guard, had reduced it with lunar caustic. That very painful operation having been performed the day before, I had had a fever all night, and thus found myself in rather poor condition to go up to the assault. No matter, there was no room for hesitation. Besides, I confess I was quite proud of the command entrusted to me by the Marshal. 8 companies of grenadiers. To me, a simple captain, that was magnificent. I therefore hurried to make my preparations, and, at first light, I went to the trench, where I found General Razou, who, after handing me command of the grenadiers, pointed out that, as the mine could not be fired for an hour, I would do well to use that time to go and examine the wall that the mine was to bring down, and to calculate the width of the breach that would result, so as to prepare my attack. I set off, accompanied by an adjutant from the engineers, who was to guide me through the ruins of a huge quarter already laid low, and at last I reached the foot of the convent wall. There ended the ground we had won. I found myself in a small courtyard. A picket of voltigeurs, occupying a kind of nearby cellar, had in this courtyard a sentry sheltered from musket fire by a heap of planks and doors. The engineer adjutant, pointing out to me a thick wall facing us, told me that this was the one that would be blown up as soon as the mine was charged. In one corner of the courtyard, where a pump had been removed, the fall of some stones had left a gap. The sentry pointed out to me that by bending down, one could see through this opening the legs of a large enemy force standing in the convent garden. To verify the fact, and to reconnoitre the lay of the ground on which I was about to fight, I bent down. But, immediately, a Spaniard posted on the bell tower of Santa Engracia fired at me, and I fell to the paving stones. At first I felt no pain, and thought the adjutant beside me had pushed me inadvertently. But soon the blood gushed in great spurts. I had received a bullet in my left side, quite close to the heart. The adjutant helped me up, and we entered the cellar where the voltigeurs were. I lost so much blood that I nearly fainted. There were no stretchers. The soldiers therefore passed a musket under my arms, another under my knees, and carried me thus through the 1,001 passages cut through the debris of that vast quarter to the point where I had left General Razout. There I came to. The general wanted to have me dressed, but I preferred to be treated by Dr. Assalani, and, compressing my wound with my handkerchief, I had myself taken to Marshal Lannes' headquarters, set a cannon shot from the town, in the immense building of an abandoned inn at the place called the Locks of the Canal of Aragon. Seeing me arrive covered in blood, carried by soldiers, one of whom was supporting my head, the marshal and my comrades thought I was dead. Dr. Assalani said the opposite, and hurried to dress my wound. But no one knew where to put me, for all the furniture of the inn had been burned during the siege, and there was not a single bed left. We slept on the bricks with which the rooms were paved. The marshal and all my comrades at once gave their cloaks, which were piled up to make a heap, and on this they laid me down. The doctor examined my wound and recognized that I had received into my body a projectile whose shape must have been flat, since it had passed between 2 ribs without breaking them, which an ordinary bullet could not have done. To find this projectile, Assalani inserted a probe into the wound. He found nothing. His face grew anxious, and seeing that I complained of the sharpest pains in my loins, he turned me onto my stomach and examined my back. But scarcely had he touched the point where the ribs meet the spinal column, when I could not suppress a cry. The projectile was there. Assalani, arming himself with a scalpel, made a large incision, saw a metal object presenting itself between 2 ribs, and tried to extract it with forceps. But, unable to succeed, despite violent efforts that lifted me up, he had one of my comrades sit on my shoulders, another on my calves, and finally managed to wrench out a lead bullet of the largest caliber, to which the fanatical Spaniards had given the shape of a small coin by flattening it with hammer blows. A cross had been engraved on each face. Finally, Notches cut all around made this bullet resemble a watch wheel. It was these kinds of teeth which, having caught among the muscles, had made extraction so difficult. The bullet, thus crushed and presenting too much surface to enter a musket, must have been fired from a blunderbuss. Presenting itself askew, it acted like a cutting instrument, passed between two ribs, bent around inside the chest, and came out in the same way it had gone in, luckily keeping enough force to pass through the muscles and flesh of the back. The marshal, wishing to show the emperor with what fanatical determination the inhabitants of Zaragoza were defending themselves, had the bullet taken from my body sent to him. Napoleon, after examining it, had it carried to my mother, informing her that I was about to be appointed squadron leader. Dr. Lannes was one of the foremost surgeons of the time, and, thanks to him, my wound, which could have been fatal, proved to be one of those that healed the most quickly. The marshal owned a mechanical bed that followed him everywhere on campaign. He kindly lent me a mattress and sheets. My portmanteau served as a pillow, and a cloak as a blanket. Yet I was very unwell, for the room, having neither doors nor windows, let in both wind and even rain. Add to this that the ground floor of the inn served as a field hospital, so that below me there were many wounded men, whose groans increased my pain. The nauseating odor that this hospital gave off rose up to me. More than 200 sutlers had set up their stalls around headquarters. A camp was close by. It was, therefore, unending songs, shouts, drum rolls, and, to complete this infernal music, the bass part was provided by a great many guns, firing night and day at the city. I could not sleep. I spent 15 days in this miserable condition. At last, my strong constitution prevailed, and I was able to get up. As the climate of Aragon is very mild, I took advantage of it to take short walks, leaning on the arm of good Dr. Lannes or of my friend de Viry. But their duties kept them from staying long with me, and I was often bored. One day my servant came to tell me that an old hussar, bathed in tears, was asking to see me. You will guess it was my former mentor, Sergeant Major Pertelet, whose regiment had just arrived in Spain, and who, on hearing that I was wounded, had hurried to me. I saw this brave man again with pleasure, and welcomed him warmly. He often came to keep me company and distract me with his interminable stories and the odd bits of advice he still thought he could give me. My convalescence was brief, and toward the 15th of March I was almost recovered, though still very weak. Death was making dreadful ravages among the inhabitants and the garrison of Zaragoza, where typhus, famine, steel, and fire had killed nearly a full third, without the rest thinking of surrender, and yet the most important forts had been taken, and the mines had already destroyed a very considerable part of the city. The monks, having persuaded those poor people that the French would butcher them, no one dared leave the place, when chance and the clemency of Marshal Lannes brought about the end of this memorable siege. On the 20th of March, the French, having taken by storm a convent of nuns, found there not only the nuns, but more than 300 women of every condition, who had taken refuge in the church. They were treated with great respect and brought before the marshal. These unfortunate women, having found themselves surrounded on all sides for several days, had not been able to receive any provisions from the city. They were dying of hunger. Good Marshal Lannes himself led them to the market of the camp, where, calling all the sutlers, he ordered them to bring food to these women, adding that he would see to the payment. The marshal's generosity did not stop there. He had them all escorted back to Zaragoza. On their return to the city, the population, which from the roofs and bell towers had followed them with their eyes, rushed out to meet them, to hear the tale of their adventure. All praised the marshal and the French soldiers. Thus, from that moment, the frenzy of that unhappy population subsided, and it was agreed to surrender. That very evening, Zaragoza capitulated. Marshal Lannes, fearing that, before laying down their arms, some fanatics would cut the throat of Prince Fuentes Pignatelli, made it the first condition that he should be returned to him alive. We thus saw this unfortunate man arrive, escorted by a jailer with an atrocious face who, after having treated him very harshly during his long captivity, had the effrontery to escort him, pistols at his belt, into the marshal's room, wanting, he said, to have a receipt in the very hand of the chief of the French army. The marshal had him shown the door, but the man, unwilling to go without a receipt, stirred the very short patience of l'Abbé Douairière, who flew into a passion and made him go down the stairs with great kicks to the backside. As for Prince Pignatelli, he was truly pitiful to see, so much had he suffered during his imprisonment. He was burning with fever, and there was not a single bed to offer him, for, as I have already said, the marshal had lodged in a completely bare house, which had the advantage of being placed near the point of attack, whereas General Junot, far less conscientious, had settled a good league from the city, in a rich monastery. He lived there very well and offered hospitality to the prince, who accepted it. It proved fatal to him, for Junot had him feast so heartily that his stomach, ruined by the prison regime, could not bear this sudden change, and Prince Pignatelli died at the very moment when his return to freedom made him so happy. He left more than 900,000 francs of income to a collateral relative who had almost nothing. When a place capitulates, it is customary for officers to keep their swords. So it was for those of the garrison of Zaragoza, except for the governor, Palafox, with regard to whom the marshal had received special instructions from the emperor. Here are the reasons. Count Palafox, a colonel in the bodyguards and a devoted friend of Ferdinand VII, had followed him to Bayonne. The abdication of that prince and of Charles IV having cast into consternation the Spanish nobles whom Napoleon had assembled in a national body, almost all recognized Joseph as their king, because, finding themselves in France in the emperor's power, they feared being arrested. It appears that Count Palafox, having had the same fears, had also recognized King Joseph, but, hardly back in Spain, he hastened to protest against the moral violence that he claimed had been done to him, and ran to place himself at the head of the insurgents of Zaragoza. The emperor regarded this conduct as perfidy, and ordered that, after the capture of the city, Count Palafox should be treated not as a prisoner of war, but as a state prisoner, therefore disarmed and taken to the keep of Vincennes. Marshal Lannes was thus obliged to send an officer to arrest the governor of Zaragoza and demand his sword. It was to d'Albuquerque that he gave this mission. It seemed all the more painful to him, since not only was d'Albuquerque a Spaniard, but a relative, a former companion, and a friend of Palafox. I have never been able to understand what led the marshal to make such a choice for such a mission. Forced to obey, d'Albuquerque entered Zaragoza more dead than alive. He presented himself to Palafox, who, handing him his sword, said with noble pride, "If your forefathers, the illustrious d'Albuquerques, return to this world, there is not one who would not prefer to be in the place of the prisoner who gives up this sword covered with glory, rather than in that of the renegade who comes to take it in the name of the enemies of Spain, his country." Poor d'Albuquerque, terrified and on the point of fainting, was obliged to lean against a piece of furniture. The scene was told to us by Captain Pasquale, who, commissioned by the emperor to receive Palafox after his arrest, was present at the interview between that general and d'Albuquerque. Count Palafox was taken to France and remained there from the month of March, 1809, until 1814. The oddity of human affairs. Palafox having been proclaimed governor of Zaragoza at the moment of the insurrection, fame and history have attributed to him the merit of the heroic defense of that city, and yet he contributed very little to it, for he fell gravely ill in the first days of the siege and handed over command to General Saint-Marc, a Belgian in the service of Spain. It was therefore he who sustained all our attacks with remarkable courage and talent. But, as he was a foreigner, Spanish pride transferred all the glory of the defense to Palafox, whose name will pass into posterity, while that of the brave and modest General Saint-Marc has remained unknown, for no account has mentioned him. On the day after the capitulation, the garrison of Zaragoza, after filing past Marshal Lannes, laid down their arms and were directed to France as prisoners of war. But, as they still numbered 40,000 men, 2/3 escaped to begin killing Frenchmen again, by joining various partisans who were waging a relentless war on us. However, a very large part of the men who left Zaragoza died of typhus, the germ of which they carried away. As for the city, its streets, almost entirely destroyed, were true charnel houses filled with the dead and the dying. The contagion even spread to the French troops who formed the new garrison. That concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.